Mr. Thomas, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very much honored to be able to share with you almost 40 decades of research and inquiry into the problems that prevent widespread social justice and economic equity. It was a long-standing passion of mine to find pathways to economic equity and social justice. And in my research, I quickly zeroed in on the money system as a fundamental problem that prevents social justice and economic equity. Now, I know it's hard to imagine a world in which there is no money and no interest. Maybe easier to imagine one without interest than without money. But let me explain a little bit about what I mean about a world without money. But first, I'll share some quotes with you just to make the point that things that we have a hard time imagining don't necessarily mean that it's impossible. Thomas Watson, the chairman of IBM, thought there was only the need for about 5 computers in the world. And the head of IBM later on, when he was presented with the idea of a copying machine, rejected it as having no market value. Likewise, Robert Milken, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, did not believe that we would ever be able to have atomic power. Lord Kelvin thought that heavier than air flying machines were impossible. And David Sarnoff's associates in what later became the Radio Corporation of America did not think that radio had any commercial value. But I maintain that a world without money and interest is not only possible, but it's essential and inevitable. Now, I'm not talking about a world without cash. We already have that to a large extent in places around the world. And in Sweden, they have basically eliminated cash entirely. So I'm not talking about the elimination of paper notes. I'm talking about the elimination or transcendence of political monies that are issued by the banking system. Monies like the dollar, the pound, the euro, the ringgit. These monies will eventually pass away as we create better systems to mediate the exchange process. So we need to face the fundamental facts of life in today's world. We live in what's been called a corporatocracy, where we have an increasing concentration of power and wealth in the hands of multinational corporations. And at the top of that pyramid, that power pyramid, are the banking corporations. Every time we have a crisis, we end up with fewer banks and bigger banks, and the banks are too big to fail. We saw recently with the financial meltdown of 2008 that governments stepped forward to save the banking system, not to save the debtors that were lured into taking loans that they could not afford to pay. We've been warned about this repeatedly, and this quote from Franklin Roosevelt, who was the President of the United States from 1933 until his death in 1944, warned about a private power rising up to eclipse the power of governments. And we've seen this happen especially over the last several decades, starting with the 1980s, the Reagan-Thatcher era. This really kicked into high gear. So we see national governments surrendering sovereignty to corporate power. So we have these national, transnational institutions like the Bank for International Settlements, the IMF, the World Bank, and we have many trade agreements that have basically forced governments to cede sovereignty to this corporate power. What we would really like to see is a downward ceding of power to people and communities, so we end up with more democratic governments and more power in the hands of the people. Now, there are many modes of exploitation that have been recorded throughout history, and we can point to them colonialism did not end with World War II when the British pulled out of Africa and the French pulled out of Indochina, and other colonial powers withdrew. It was just a matter of colonialism taking on more subtle mechanisms for exploitation. So we have monopolies and oligopolies, we have all kinds of market manipulations, not the least of which is the manipulation of money and the foreign exchange markets. We still have people being dispossessed of their possessions, their land, in many different ways. The original example that's pointed to about enclosures was in Britain a few hundred years ago, when the commons were enclosed and turned over to the lords, and the people were forced off the land and into the cities to fuel the Industrial Revolution with labor. So we still have overt slavery. You know, we have examples in the news all the time about slave ships in Thailand and Indonesia, people being forced onto the fishing boats and into the fish factories. And we have wage slavery that's widespread. But by far, the biggest form of exploitation is debt slavery. And we've been all forced to play that game and to become indebted to the banks in one way or another. Now, the Rothschild patriarch several hundred years ago said, "Give me the power to create a nation's money, and I don't care who makes the laws." Because as we've seen, and is becoming ever more clear, those who have the money and the power to create money can buy politicians and force legislation that's favorable to their interests. So I want to emphasize the essence and the purpose of money. And this doesn't often come through in standard economics textbooks, but money is basically a credit instrument. It's supposed to facilitate reciprocal exchange. Now, when I talk about reciprocal exchange, I'm talking about trade, where you expect to get as much as you give and give as much as you get. However, money has been perverted to serve different purposes. The money system that we have centralizes power and concentrates wealth. And that's true across the board and around the world. So the basic elements of this debt money regime: we have a credit monopoly in the hands of a banking cartel. And in each country there is a central bank that sort of regulates the power to create money amongst the different commercial banks. And we have a national currency that has legal tender status, which forces the use of that currency. And that credit money is lent into circulation by banks, and they charge interest, riba, usury, for its use. So the way I describe it is, we give our credit to the banks, and then we ask them to lend some of it back to us and pay interest for the privilege. And when you really think about it, every national currency is supported by the credit of the people in that zone. So in the United States, it's the people of the United States, it's our credit that supports the US dollar, and likewise in other countries around the world. So the fact that these loans are the basis for the creation of money creates a debt growth imperative, which creates an economic growth imperative. And I argue that this is what is driving us to destruction. It's causing social destruction, ecological destruction, economic destruction across the board. So this is the exponential growth function, which is what the compound interest formula is. And looking at the empirical evidence, we can see very clearly in this chart the growth of debt over time, especially looking from 1980 to the present time. The blue line is the total global credit market debt in dollar terms, reaching at this point about $180 trillion. The red line is that debt as a percentage of gross domestic product, which is supposedly a measure of overall economic activity. And if you look at the dashed line at the bottom, that is the growth of GDP. So we've seen that the growth of debt is far outstripping the growth of GDP. I might add that it's also outstripping the growth of population or any other measure that you want to look at. And this is all due to this debt money system. So I talk about the credit commons as being the collective credit of the people. And the only way that you can tap the credit commons is to go through a bank. And the banks will either lend into the private sector or the public sector. So individuals take loans, companies take loans, municipalities take loans, national governments take loans. And then, of course, you have lending back and forth between the two. In the real estate bubble that we had building up until 2007, 2008, you had banks using transactions in real estate as a basis for creating additional debt. Then when the banks had to recognize that some of those loans were not being serviced, when the people who borrowed the money could not pay what they owed, then those houses went back on the market, forced prices down, and the banks had to realize that those debts were no longer collectible. So what happened? The governments didn't bail out the people who were in debt, they bailed out the banks, basically taking the bad debts off the hands of the banks and giving them government bonds in return through a roundabout process. Now some of the debt was written off, but most of it was taken on by the governments. So we had huge amounts of government debt being taken on throughout the crisis. And in the United States, as one example, from 2008 until the present time, the national debt of the United States has doubled just in 8 years' time. So since we have this debt growth imperative, the banks have to find ever more and new ways to create debt. So you have the seduction of consumers by giving them consumer credit, buy now, pay later, and this kicked into high gear with the initiation of credit cards 50, 60 years ago. Then they came up with the idea of student loans, which of course were government guaranteed to induce the banks to give them. When I was a student in university, there was no such thing as a student loan. And then of course we've had lending for speculation. We had the stock market bubble in the late 90s up to about 2001. Then we had the real estate bubble. And government guarantees, of course, take all the hazard out of the banking realm and put it on to the government and the people that support the government. So to sum up, the substance of modern money is credit. And it takes the form of bank deposits or a few currency notes in the hands of the people. But 97% roughly of all the money in circulation is in the form of bank deposits. Checking deposits primarily, some savings deposits. So the question is, how do we resolve this predicament that businesses and communities face of being caught in the debt trap? Well, we need to reduce our dependence upon banks and conventional money. And we do that by creating independent exchange media that are interest-free. And let me diverge for a moment to tell a little story. I grew up in the city of Rochester in New York State, which is in the northeastern part of the United States. And the one thing, I guess, that Rochester was most famous for was the Eastman Kodak Company. The company that dominated the market for photography for over 100 years. Founded in 1888 by George Eastman, and the Kodak Company still exists, but between 1988 and 2008, the employment at Eastman Kodak dropped by 80%. And in 2012, the company declared bankruptcy. What happened? Digital photography is what happened. Digital photography is a prime example of something that is called a disruptive technology. And one of the books that I am indebted to for introducing this concept is The Innovators Dilemma, written by an MIT professor, Clayton Christensen. So the book was written before digital photography disrupted the photography market, but he used other examples. The ironic thing about it is that digital photography was invented at Eastman Kodak Company. But when the engineer who invented it showed it to management, their response was, "That's cute, but don't tell anybody about it." Well, why? Well, because their cash cow was film and chemicals and processing, and they didn't want to disturb that market. So they resisted developing digital photography. But others took it on and did develop it. Now, initially, a disruptive technology is inferior. And this first digital camera was the size of a toaster. Certainly not very practical, and the resolution was very poor. But as the technology was developed and improved, it was eventually able to displace almost totally the old technology. So I argue that we have disruptive technologies in the realm of money and banking. And what those are private currencies issued by trusted producers and direct credit clearing amongst buyers and sellers. The concept of credit clearing is well established. Banks have been doing it for a long, long time. You know, I might pay you by writing a check drawn on my bank in Arizona, and you might deposit that check in your bank in some other place like Kuala Lumpur, and it's no problem. The reason it's no problem is because the banks have a way of clearing their obligations amongst themselves. So we can do the same thing with traders directly. Traders that have something to sell and want to buy something can simply clear credits amongst themselves. And this is actually being done. But some examples of private currencies, during the 1930s and the Depression, we had many different scrip issues, which were basically private currencies issued by different entities, businesses and school districts. And I wrote about that in my second and third books. In Argentina, we had popular trading clubs popping up from the 1990s onward, and each of those clubs issued their own currency notes as a way of transacting business. Even provinces in Argentina were issuing provincial notes because there wasn't enough national currency reaching the hinterlands. We have rebate currencies like Canadian Tire money. Airline frequent flyer miles could be a private currency if they would make them transferable easily from person to person, and all kinds of company credit vouchers. Now, the way a private currency works is this. You have an issuer, and the issuer could be a business, or it could be a municipal government, or some other entity. Basically, they could put their currency into circulation by using it to pay their workers and suppliers when those workers and suppliers provide services and goods. Now, the workers and suppliers, of course, need to pass that on. They need to do something with it. So you need to get the merchants in the local community to accept that currency in return for the goods and services that they bring to market. But the thing that makes the whole thing work is the reciprocity circuit being closed when the issuer accepts the currency back in payment for something of value. Now, if it's a business issuer, that business issuer has to provide goods and services to the market and accept his own currency in return for payment. In the case of a municipal issuer, they have to accept it as payment for taxes and fees. So that's basically the reciprocity circuit that you have to close in any private currency issuance. So I'm sure you all have some familiarity with the concept of liquidity. Very simply, liquidity is the ability to pay. Now, whether it's ability to pay in conventional money or in some alternative kind of payment. But just to give an example of liquidity versus illiquidity, people often fail to make a distinction between money and wealth. We tend to use those terms interchangeably in many contexts. But wealth may not be liquid. You may own real estate, you may own inventories in your business, you may own goats, sheep, cows, might have crops in the field. Those are illiquid forms of wealth. You cannot use them normally to make payments to people that you owe something to. So you have to first take them to market and convert them into money. Monetization is the process of creating money, transforming illiquid wealth to liquid wealth. So this is done currently when banks make a loan on collateral. So you might go to a bank as a business and you say, I've got inventories and accounts receivable. These are close to liquid, but they're not quite. Would you lend me money on the strength of those assets as collateral? Or even more extreme, would you lend me money on the basis of the factory buildings and the equipment that I own? So in the process of granting a loan on that collateral, the bank is monetizing the value of that collateral. Now we can do that directly. With direct monetization by producers, the business spends its own currency into circulation and then later accepts it back in payment, just as we saw in the diagram that I showed a minute ago. So in either case, we're taking the value of existing supplies and putting it in a form that can be used as payment. Now, we have in existence local credit clearing exchanges that provide this service to businesses. These are just a few. BBX, whose logo I show on this slide, is actually one that you have right here in Malaysia. It's run by a friend of mine, Dr. Lee. She claims that they have 30,000 business members in 11 different countries as part of this credit clearing trade exchange. The IRTA is the International Reciprocal Trade Association. It's the trade association for commercial barter companies or trade exchanges. Now what they do, of course, is not barter, it's credit clearing. The way it works is this. You have an association, which is a network of trust, and you have members who join that association. Now I distinguish between issuing members and non-issuing members. The issuing members are the ones that have the capacity to provide things that everybody wants. So they qualify to have a line of credit. That means that they can spend before they earn. They can have a balance in their account that is negative. Everybody else must have a positive balance before they can spend. So the way it starts out is one of the issuing members uses his credit to buy something from another member. Those credits can then circulate throughout the community of traders. Eventually he has to clear his balance by accepting credits to pay for what he provides to the market. It's a very simple concept, but it's very effective. So the benefits of community currencies and trade exchange credits, they provide an independent means of payment that does not involve the banks, that can be interest-free, and that we can have under our own control at our local community level. So that reduces our dependence on bank borrowing, reduces our interest costs, reduces the risk of insolvency, because now we don't have to speculate about our ability to acquire dollars or ringgit or other official currency. We can transact business in our own currency. And it provides the local economy with supplemental liquidity. Now, just as in a community, everybody is able to use ringgit whether they borrow from a bank or not, likewise, everybody in the community could use the private currencies that we issue to transact their own business. So we can enable our local businesses to better compete with transnational companies and corporate chains, and we can enable a more complete use of the available labor and supplies. There are in many instances situations where we have surplus capacity alongside unmet needs. Now, why can't we match up the surplus capacity with the unmet needs? Well, typically it's because there isn't enough money in circulation within the community. The money is somewhere else. So we can ameliorate that situation. So I've been trying to work with entrepreneurs and social change agents and others to try to bring into reality more of these innovative approaches to exchange. And the skills and the expertise needed to do this revolve around mainly these four things. You have to think in terms of sound principles of reciprocal exchange. And sound principles of commercial banking have long since been cast aside. And what banks do today, to a large extent, is unsound. And much of what they monetize is improper. When a bank monetizes government debt, that is an improper basis for creating money. Because money should be created on the basis of goods and services that are in the market now or shortly to arrive in the market. We have to think in terms of systems. And this is one advantage I have from my engineering background, is systems thinking, particularly chemical engineering, because it's all about systems, moving things from one place to another, heating them up, cooling them down, mixing them together. We also should be looking at the conditions that lead to innovative change. And The Innovation Secrets of Steve Jobs is one of the books that I recommend. I've been fascinated by the life of Steve Jobs and the work that he has done with computers and other innovations that he brought to market. And we need to also understand the science of networks. So what I see coming on the horizon, and not very far off, is mutual credit clearing exchanges I expect to proliferate around the world. That these will develop standard practices of design and practice, which will allow the exchanges to network together, just like our computers are networked together today. And I expect that we will see a worldwide web of exchange that's free of interest and free of bank control. So we can maintain control of credit at the local level while having a means of payment that's globally useful. That's the ultimate objective. So we have the power to do that. It's just a matter of getting the pieces assembled and having the passion to bring it about. Thank you.